So traditionally, stammering symptoms have been classified as either primary or secondary. And the primary symptoms are the core of the disorder, whereas the secondary symptoms represent the various ways in which we learn to cope with it, to cope with the disorder. And it's generally understood that primary symptoms are not really under our voluntary control. So if we try to control them, we're usually not able to voluntarily control them. Whereas the secondary symptoms are under voluntary control, or at least they're under partial voluntary control. Now, I would suggest that although researchers in the past have always spoken in terms of primary and secondary symptoms, I would say it's a bit of an artificial dichotomy, that in fact it's much more realistic to think of the symptoms as forming a sort of continuum. So you've got some symptoms that are right in the middle of the disorder and some that are more external to it, and a bit like layers of an onion. So which symptom in particular is right at the centre of the disorder? Well, I would argue that in terms of the subjective experience of stammering, the thing right at the centre that stammerers will always say is that they experience an inability to initiate articulation. What that means is that they know the word that they want to say, and yet when they go to say it, they find they just can't get it out. It won't happen. Like, they can't make the right movements, or the movements that they need to make are just not happening. So this inability to initiate articulation, or to move forward with articulation, seems to be the absolute core of the onion, or of the stammering, the most primary symptom of all. And then there are what I would call attention-holding behaviours. So these are like the middle layers of the onion. And these are, generally speaking, not always present right at the beginning when somebody first starts to stammer. They may be developed shortly after the stammerer starts to experience this inability to initiate articulation. And then, finally, and the last sort of symptoms to develop, the outer layers of the onion, if you like, can be divided into two types. One that I'm going to call avoidance, and the other I would call escape behaviours. Okay, so I'm going to look at these three types of symptom in detail now and explain exactly what we mean by them. Just before I do, this slide is just reminding us that whereas the symptoms right at the core of the disorder we don't seem to have very much voluntary control over at all, the more peripheral the symptoms, the more towards the outside of the onion they are, the more we have voluntary control. So we have quite a bit of voluntary control over whether or not we avoid things, avoid words or situations or people, whether or not we use escape behaviours. And we have some voluntary control over the attention-holding behaviours, but they tend to be more deeply ingrained, and so they're not as easy to control. What are the attention-holding behaviours? Well, this is where I have a slightly different opinion to many other researchers, insofar as I would suggest that symptoms like repetitions and prolongations and fillers, so fillers are sounds or words like and or actually or like, well, they're interjections, those are called. Basically, they're words or sounds that fill the gaps, that fill these silent pauses that happen at the moments when we find ourselves unable to say the word that we want to say. These attention-holding behaviours do exactly what their name suggests. They hold the attention of the listener, and they signal to the listener that we are trying to say something, we are trying to say a word, but we're just not actually managing it. And they signal to the listener that we want to continue to be allowed to try, and we don't want other people to interrupt us because we're still trying. Avoidance behaviors, and as I said, these are some of the behaviors that develop last of all, are avoidance, they're behaviors that we gradually develop because the experience of stuttering is not a pleasant experience. And because it's unpleasant, the temptation is to avoid the experience. And the easiest way to avoid the experience of stuttering is to avoid either the words that we stutter on, avoid the people that we're likely to stutter with, or avoid the situations in which we're likely to stutter. But all of these boil down to avoiding unpleasant experiences, basically. It's like avoiding pain. And the longer the stutter goes on, the more of these sort of avoidance behaviours we're likely to develop. Escape behaviours are something completely different. They are also quite late to develop, and what they are is they're ways that we find seem to help us to push through the stammer or to push through the block, to help us to keep on talking. And the most common sort of escape behaviours involve some sort of pushing or force. So we try to push the words out, and we might use lots of muscle tension. Another sort of escape behaviour is what can be called or termed cluttering. Now, by cluttering, I mean trying to get lots of words out very quickly. And it seems that stutterers often do this because they know that when they start to get a few words out, if they keep on going, often they can keep on going. So the temptation is to get out as many words as they can before the next block comes. And so what you often find with stutterers, especially the more severe ones, is that they'll have a big long block where nothing's coming out. They're pushing, but they're not managing to get anything out. And then all of a sudden they say a whole lot of words all in one go, and then they block again. And then they say a lot more words in one go, and then they block again. So the words all get jumbled together. They get cluttered, basically. And the trouble with cluttering is that it's quite hard for the listener to understand, because the words are pretty poorly formed and all squidged up with each other. Another sort of escape behaviour, and this is a sort of pushing really, is muscle jerks. So it's as though we have this idea that if I can suddenly jerk my body like this, or jerk my head back, but I'll jerk the words out. And what you sometimes see in stutterers is that they get into a habit of trying to get the words out in that way. And these behaviours are very pronounced sometimes, so they look very abnormal. It can sometimes even look abnormal to the point where it looks like the person's having a seizure or something like that. We should point out that the escape behaviours, because they look abnormal, they also hold the listener's attention, probably for all the wrong reasons, because the listener's wondering why the speaker's making all those funny movements. But that attention-holding capacity that these escape behaviours have also reinforces them, because we will experience that if we use these escape behaviours, people will pay attention to us. Okay. So another thing then about these escape behaviours is that they do occasionally work. So if we push, and we push hard enough, sometimes we do manage to push the words out, and it does get us going again. They also, like I said, they attract listeners' attention, but they look very abnormal, and they're extremely hard work. So if your speech involves a lot of these escape behaviours, you're going to get very tired of talking. It's not going to be a pleasant experience for you. You get out of breath, you'll get dizzy. And also, these escape behaviours can make it quite hard for the listener to understand, especially cluttering. And so, although they may occasionally work, overall, they make things worse, and it would be better if we didn't use them. One of the good things about escape behaviours is that because they do consist of this, or they do form the outermost layer of this onion of symptoms, they're the symptoms that we do have quite a lot of control over. So we can decide, we can make a voluntary decision not to do them anymore. It's quite possible for a stammerer simply to think or to decide one day, well, from now on I'm not going to use these. But of course, if they stop using them, their silent blocks may become more of a problem because the speaker might not realise that they're still trying to speak. And so if they stop using escape behaviours, they are likely to find it more difficult to hold the listener's attention. So this is a bit of a dilemma, really. And so the answer is perhaps not to stop using escape behaviours entirely, but to try to find some other escape behaviours that are less pathological, that are less tiring, less hard work, and less abnormal looking. And the two fluency enhancing techniques that I've been teaching over these last 2 weeks, that is the jump and orchestral speech, they themselves are forms of escape behaviour. They're techniques that we use to get us through, to keep us going, to help us escape from stammering, basically. So they too are escape behaviours, but we could call them helpful escape behaviours. And so the jump that we were doing today, simply involving abandoning the sound that we're stuck on and continuing on from the sound after that. And orchestral speech can be used as an escape behaviour in conjunction with the jump. So if you find that you've used the jump and the person hasn't understood you, you can always go back and you can repeat the entire utterance that you wanted to say, or the phrase that you wanted to say, using orchestral speech, and that'll help you get through it. So again, these are escape behaviours, but they're useful ones that will help us and have an overall beneficial effect.